Outside, the blizzard roared as if to tear the mountains apart. Inside the cabin, breath and heartbeat rose louder than the wind. Eli lifted Aveline into his arms and laid her on the bed layered with furs. He bent close, lips brushing her neck, trembling, yet earnest, as if in prayer. Aveline closed her eyes and let out a long breath, yielding to the steady hands that were once a stranger's. Cloth slipped to the wooden floor, her skin glowing against the firelight. Eli's calloused hands traced her, gentler than any promise spoken. His mouth moved from her shoulder down her back, each kiss pressed deep into the emptiness she carried. Beyond the walls, snow smothered the land. Within, two souls torn from their pasts found life in each other's warmth. The kisses were not desire alone, but a silent vow that when the storm was done, neither would walk alone again. The winter of 1873 fell on Montana like the fury of heaven itself. Snow did not drift down in gentle flakes, but poured in a blinding white curtain, driven by winds that howled through the mountain passes. The valley turned into a sea of ice, the wagon trails westward erased in a single night. In that frozen wasteland, Aveline Johnson knelt by a mound of earth hard as stone, her cracked hands bleeding from digging with a broken hoe and a dulled spade. A rough white cloth covered the body of the man she once called her husband, Nathan, now blurred beneath the snow, as if the world itself rushed to bury every trace. Aveline planted a makeshift wooden cross, torn from the frame of a shattered wagon, into the grave. The wind struck hard, nearly toppling her frail frame. Her dark eyes shone with water, but the tears froze before they could fall. There was no one to witness the farewell. The wagon train had scattered, some dead, some fled, leaving a black widow alone in a wilderness of white. She whispered, voice caught in her throat, "Rest easy, Nathan. I am sorry I could not keep you here." The wind moaned back its reply. Aveline pulled the frayed wool shawl tight around her shoulders, sank down, and gasped for breath, hollow inside. The man had sworn to guard her all his days, yet in a single shot, with blood spreading across the snow, she was left a widow at the edge of the world. A howl split the silence, then another. Aveline flinched. Yellow eyes glimmered in the trees. Wolves, starving in the brutal season, had caught the scent of flesh. She clutched the revolver Nathan had left her, her hand shaking so hard she doubted she could hit even one. Her heart pounded, breath breaking into thin smoke. Dark shapes moved low across the snow, circling the fresh mound. In that moment of terror, Aveline saw the truth plain. No children, no husband, no company left to walk beside her. If she died here, her name would vanish with her. Then came another sound, strange, heavy, cutting through the howls, the thud of hooves on deep snow. Out of the white haze rode a figure, a rider in a dark hide coat, shoulders capped with frost, steady on a powerful gray horse. He halted a few paces away, silent, watching. From under the brim of his quintamon hat, eyes glimmered in the dim light of a fading sky. Gray eyes, cold and still as stone. The wolves fell silent, backing off. They growled, but did not advance. The man's presence carried a weight that made even beasts keep their distance. Aveline gripped her gun tighter, tried to speak out, but it broke into a trembling rasp. "Stay back. I have a weapon." The cowboy gave no answer. He drew his reins, the horse blowing steam into the freezing air. Wind tossed his hair wild, showing a sun-darkened face, unshaven, rough. His gaze on Aveline held no pity, no hunger, only the measure of something strange that had crossed into his world. For a heartbeat their eyes met. She thought herself frozen again. Those eyes were ice, yet deep within burned something unnamed, a fire bound tight. The storm shrieked, a wolf lunged close. The cowboy raised his rifle, one crack split the mountains. The beast dropped, blood red against white. The rest howled and scattered. Smoke drifted from the barrel as he lowered it, turning back to the widow. Aveline staggered back, slipped into a drift, and fell. Her numb hand clung to the revolver, eyes locked on the rider. He urged his horse forward a step. His voice came rough, edged with the mountain wind and gunpowder. "If you aim to live through this night, stand up and come with me." Her throat closed. The words were both command and judgment. In that instant she saw her life balanced. Die in the snow beside her husband's grave, or follow this stranger whose eyes carried what she could not yet name. She rose, trembling, still clutching the gun. The wind tore at her shawl, scattering frozen tears. The cowboy kept his gaze on her, gray eyes fixed, the widow's small form caught in the storm. A sight that would not leave him, planting the first seed of a story neither yet knew they were stepping into. The storm still raged, wind hurling snow into their faces like 1,000 needles. Aveline followed behind the cowboy, her feet numb as if no longer her own. He moved ahead with long, steady strides, barely swayed by the broken slopes of the mountain. She stumbled at nearly every step, fighting the wind that sought to sweep her off the ridge. Each time she fell, his rough hand seized her wrist and hauled her back up, never a word of comfort. That grip was not gentle, but unyielding, like a man holding a wild horse to keep it from bolting. Aveline longed to cry out that she needed no help, that she could manage alone, but her throat was raw, and only gasps and broken sobs escaped. At last, through the white curtain, the shape of a cabin appeared. Tucked beneath a cliff, it loomed black against the snow. The cowboy shoved the heavy wooden door open. The hinges groaned, and warmth rushed out like invisible arms around them. He shed his hide coat and hung it on a peg by the door, then turned, his voice low and rough as a command. "This is my place. If you aim to survive the winter, you live by my law." Aveline froze, trembling from cold and anger both. I don't belong to anyone. I only need shelter for the night. At dawn, I'll leave." His gray eyes cut across to her, sharp as a knife point. He stepped forward, his bulk blotting out the firelight. His voice dropped heavy as rolling stone. "Go where?" "Out there is wolves, snow, death. If you want to live, you belong to me. That's the law of the mountain. No arguing it." Her heart pounded hard, her body strung taut as a bow on the verge of breaking. Part of her wanted to run out into the night, but her legs would not move. His words, harsh as they were, struck like a verdict that could not be overturned. She bit her lip until it bled, swallowed back tears. "You can treat me as a burden, if you must. But I am not a slave." The cowboy paused a beat. In those cold eyes something flickered, not pity but acknowledgement. He gave no reply, only turned to a shelf, drew down a chipped porcelain cup, and poured steaming liquid. He set it on the table before her. "Drink herb tea." "Keep your hands from freezing." Aveline looked at the cup, then at his hand. Scarred and calloused, the hand that had pulled a trigger and dropped a wolf hours ago. She reached for the cup, trembling. The heat burned her lips, brought sting to her eyes, As she lifted it, she caught his gaze fixed on her. He turned away at once as though caught in a moment of weakness. His eyes were cold, yet beneath lay something buried. Concern chained and hidden beneath the hard shell. She sipped slowly, throat burning, warmth spreading. She hated herself for feeling the faintest safety in this rough shelter, under the roof of the man who declared the law of the mountain. He lowered himself into a wooden chair by the fire, unbuckled his gun belt, and set it beside him. The flames cast his shadow tall against the wall, the silhouette falling over her like a fate already decided. "My name's Eli Mercer," he said, voice gravelly. "And you, widow?" Aveline tightened her hold on the cup, voice unsteady. "Aveline Johnson." He nodded once as if carving it into memory. Then silence again, broken only by the crack of burning wood. In that silence, Aveline felt the tension stretch between them, thin, fragile, binding two wayward souls. She, stripped of all she had. He, a figure of the mountains themselves. And though fear still crowded her chest, the way Eli's eyes sometimes lingered on her had sown a seed of something she dared not yet name. Eli Mercer's cabin was not large. A rough-hewn table stood near the fire, a few rickety chairs, a shelf stacked with dried meat, cornmeal, salt, and pelts hanging along the wall. In the far corner sat a pine bed layered with thick furs. Beyond that, only a worn blanket draped across a bench by the door. That first night, Eli pointed to the bed and motioned for Aveline to rest. He tossed the blanket onto the wooden bench and stretched out as if his broad frame had little need of warmth. Aveline curled tight beneath the furs, listening to the strange chorus, the wind hissing through cracks, the groan of timber under cold, and the steady, deep breathing of the man only steps away. The days fell into a rhythm. At dawn, Eli left with his rifle slung across his shoulder, his boots cutting deep into the snow. By evening he returned with rabbits, grouse, sometimes even a deer. Aveline kept the fire, cut the meat, stirred cornmeal porridge. The meals were simple: roasted meat, corn gruel. But slowly, the cabin filled with the warm scent of smoke instead of bare, frozen wood. Words were few, the exchanges sharp, spare. "This meat needs drying. Add more wood. Storm will hold through tomorrow." And yet, in that silence, moments came that unsettled her. Once, when she slipped on the icy porch steps, Eli's rough hand clamped her elbow, his eyes locking with hers. Dark, restrained, before he released her as if nothing had passed. Another time, as she sat by the fire mending a torn sleeve, the glow lit her face, her curls catching sparks of red. Eli sat sharpening his knife, but she felt his gaze linger longer than it should. Daylight kept distance. Night was stranger still. The storm clawed at the valley, rattling the roof. Eli's bench near the door barely held warmth. For nights, Aveline lay awake, teeth chattering, until at last she whispered, "If you like, you can take the bed. I'll stay to the edge. We needn't touch." He stood a long moment, gray eyes unreadable, then gave a curt nod. That night they lay back to back, a strip of space between them like a line drawn in sand. Yet the heat from his broad back crept across, and against her will, Aveline breathed easier. The second night, in restless sleep, she felt a heavy arm tighten around her waist. She stiffened, heart racing, a cry nearly breaking free. But in his ragged breathing, she heard something she had not expected. Sobs, muffled and raw, like a child lost. I miss you and the boy. Aveline froze. His breath warmed her neck, his voice trembling in half-dream. The man she thought made only of cold command and hard law carried a wound that bled still. She closed her eyes, unmoving, letting his weight pin her as if she were the only anchor he had left. In that darkness, her heart stirred. For the first time, not with fear, but with a mixture of pity, unease, and a pull of curiosity toward the past that had shaped him into this reclusive, flinty cowboy. At dawn he rose early, withdrew his arm as if nothing had happened, fed the fire, cut meat. No word of the night before. Aveline sat watching his back, still hearing the broken whisper in her mind. The days rolled on, snow unending, forest pale. Yet the cabin no longer felt a mere shelter against the storm. In small, accidental collisions, a hand steadying her, a gaze by the fire, an unconscious embrace in the night. Aveline saw that Eli was not only the harsh voice of mountain law. Beneath the scars and roughness lay a wound, a hidden piece of him she did not yet know. And perhaps it was that hidden part that slowly, inch by inch, began to narrow the distance between them. One rare, clear morning after days of storm, Eli left early. Aveline heard the cabin door shut, then the crunch of boots on crusted snow fading into the woods. He was off to check the traps, as always. Silence settled inside, broken only by the faint whistle of wind along the walls, the soft dust of snow drifting outside. She tidied the small kitchen, stacked wood by the fire, then moved to the storage corner. A loose board gave way, revealing an old chest hidden behind sacks of meal and bundles of hides. The wood was dark, the lock rusted, paint long peeled. She hesitated, but curiosity won. She eased the lid open. Inside lay not rifles or hunting gear, but remnants of another life. A faded woman's dress, pale blue, still faint with the smell of old soap. A pair of child's leather shoes, worn down at the heels from endless running. A weathered Bible, its spine frayed. An inscription inside written in neat hand. Elizabeth Mercer, beloved wife. 1869. And a photograph, yellowed with time. A younger Eli with familiar eyes, his arm around a gentle-faced woman holding a small boy. Aveline's chest tightened. Eli, the rough, harsh man who had claimed she belonged to him to survive, had once had a family. A wife, a son, happiness, now reduced to relics buried beneath wood and dust. She sat before the fire with the photo in her lap. The words he had whispered in sleep returned. I miss you and the boy. They had not been dream nor slip of tongue, but the raw truth he carried under the hard shell of mountain law. When Eli returned with 2 rabbits slung in his hand, he stopped cold in the doorway. His shadow filled the cabin. His gray eyes darkened, fixed first on her, then on the open chest. The silence pressed so heavy Aveline could hear her heartbeat. She clutched the photo, meaning to hide it, but it was too late. She lifted her eyes instead, meeting his gaze head-on. No lies, no flight, only the bare meeting of 2 wounded souls. He set the game bag down, slow as if all strength had drained. He bent, folded the dress carefully, set it back inside. His broad hand passed over the tiny shoes, pausing long before closing the lid. No words of rage, no shouts. He dropped into the chair, fists clamped tight on his knees as if to crush the bone. Aveline still held the photo, her throat burning. Her voice was softer than the wind outside. You had them. Eli did not lift his head, only nodded, lines carved deep into his brow. Wife, son. Fever took them. 8 years now, his voice rasped, broken as rotted wood. Aveline hugged the photo to her chest, heart twisting. The man before her was no longer just the one who barked orders and laid down law. In his eyes yawned a hollow carved by loss, a scar that would never close. She did not offer pity, nor crowd him with words. She only placed the photo back in the chest and shut the lid, returning to him what he had chosen to bury. As she rose, she felt his eyes follow her. This time they held no ice but something else, fragile, quiet, wordless. That night, they ate rabbit stew by the fire, neither speaking much. Yet when their eyes met across the flames, Eli did not look away. Aveline did not turn aside. The look held longer, deeper, an unspoken accord. Between them now was more than the law of the mountain. There was a shared secret, a truth that bound. In the silence, Aveline felt her heart shift. Eli Mercer was not only the man who claimed her. He was a man who had once loved, once lost, once hurt to the bone. And it was that truth which made her begin to see him differently, not only as master of this cabin, but as a soul bound by memory, not unlike herself, chained by loss. The storm swept down from the northern range like a beast unleashed, lashing wind and snow against everything in its path. The small cabin groaned beneath the force, every crack whistling with cold. Aveline struggled to keep the fire steady, but the draft pushed smoke back inside, stinging her eyes. Eli had left that morning, saying he would check the traps and return before the storm broke. Now darkness pressed against the windows, snow hammering the roof, and still he had not come. Fear rose in her chest like waves against stone. A pounding struck the door, heavy, insistent, not the sound of wind or branch. Aveline froze. A hoarse voice called through the wood. Anyone inside? We're lost. Let us share the fire for the night. A chill raced her spine. Eli's warning echoed. Never open the door to strangers when I'm gone. Yet the pounding grew harder, as if to break the hinges. Only a woman here, another voice sneered. Open up and let us get warm and have ourselves some fun. Her blood turned cold. She snatched the revolver Eli had left, hands shaking as she leveled it toward the door. The wood shuddered. Hinges creaked. Aveline shouted, voice breaking. Leave now! I've got a gun! The door cracked open. A rough, bearded face shoved through, eyes sweeping the cabin until they fixed on her small frame. He grinned, teeth yellow in the firelight, and shoved harder. 2 more men loomed behind him, snow on their shoulders, hunger in their eyes not for food. Go on, shoot, the leader taunted, stepping inside. Her finger trembled on the trigger. The storm's howl matched her pounding heart. Then a crack split the air. A bullet slammed into the floor at the leader's boots. Not from her gun, from outside. The door burst wide. Eli Mercer strode in, coat frosted white, eyes gray as steel. His rifle smoked in his hand. Out, he growled, his voice carrying through the storm louder than any blade. One of the men forced a grin. We only wanted shelter. No harm meant. The rifle barked again. A bullet buried into the timber beside his head. All 3 froze. Eli stepped forward, long strides shaking the floor, and slammed the stock of his rifle into the leader's chest, driving him against the wall. Bone cracked. Aveline screamed, shrinking into the corner. The other two rushed in panic, but Eli was quicker. He swung the rifle broadside, smashing one to the ground. The third lunged with a knife, but Eli's massive hand caught his throat, lifting him off the floor like a rag doll. "Touch her!" Eli's voice dropped low, eyes blazing like a wolf's in the dark. "And I'll tear you apart." The leader sagged to his knees, blood streaking his face. We're leaving." Eli flung the knifeman aside, tossing him through the door like a sack. The three staggered into the blizzard, swallowed by the night. The door slammed shut. Silence fell inside, broken only by the roar of wind outside. Eli stood braced, chest heaving, rifle still clenched tight. The revolver slipped from Aveline's hand, clattering to the floor. Her whole body shook. Then, as if a cord inside her had finally snapped, she broke into sobs. Tears ran hot down her face, fierce against the cold that clung to her skin. Eli turned. His eyes still burned with fury. But when he saw her hunched in the corner, shoulders quivering, the hardness gave way. He stepped forward, hesitated a moment, then laid a hand on her shoulder. She lifted her tear-streaked face, meeting his gaze. No command, no ice, only a solid, unyielding certainty. Without a word, Eli pulled her into his chest. His arms wrapped around her, rough and unpracticed, yet firm as stone. His heartbeat thudded against her ear, steady and strong, drowning out the storm. Aveline buried her face in his snow-soaked coat, tears soaking the coarse fabric. For the first time since Nathan's death, she let herself lean into another's hold. In that moment, with the storm raging and darkness pressing in, she understood. Though it began with harshness, Eli Mercer had become the one wall between her and the cruel world. And it was his arms, rough, clumsy, but steadfast, that made her heart tremble for the first time in truth. That storm came down the mountain, as if it meant to crush it flat. Wind lashed the cabin, snow packed tight into every crack of the walls. Inside, the fire flickered weak in the hearth, too thin to hold back the cold seeping in from every seam. Eli pulled down every hide hanging from the wall, spread them on the floor, heaped them across the bed, then drew Aveline close. His voice was rough, steady as stone. "Tonight, this is the only way we keep warm. If not, the cold will take us both." Aveline froze, breath white on her lips. Her heart hammered, not only from fear of the cold, but from the closeness of him, the beat of his chest so near her own. Eli drew her into the pile of furs, his great frame radiating heat around her. At first she stiffened, her hand pressed lightly to his chest, half ready to push him back. Yet she stopped. The storm roared outside, but in here, the nearness carried both unease and a strange warmth she had never known. Their eyes met in the dim firelight. His gray eyes, once cold, now deep and unsteady, holding something fragile. He parted his lips, words faltering on the edge. "Aveline, may I?" The sentence trailed, lost in his breath, and in that moment, Aveline gave a slow nod. Not rushed, but sure. "If it is you, I am ready." The tension eased from his gaze. He bent down, his lips brushing her neck, trembling but reverent. Aveline closed her eyes, released a long breath, surrendering at last. The cloth on her body slipped away piece by piece. His calloused hands passed across her skin, gentler than any sweet words. He kissed along her shoulder, down her back, each touch pressed like a silent vow. Aveline clung to him, chest against his, feeling the thunder of his heartbeat. At first the contact was clumsy, uncertain. Then it grew into a current that swept past all boundaries. No more mountain law, no more master and captive. Only two souls, reaching for each other like the starved reaching for life after too long a winter. Outside, the blizzard howled, merciless. Inside, their breaths tangled, their movements rising and falling like the rhythm of the land itself. Aveline felt his rough strength, but also the tenderness he had never shown. He was no longer the man who barked commands. He was a man pleading for a place to lay down a broken heart. When all had quieted, they lay wrapped in furs, her head resting on his shoulder, her fingers tracing faint circles on his chest. His arm locked around her, as if letting go would see her vanish into the white night. "You don't regret it?" His voice cracked, raw as dying embers. Aveline smiled in the dark, her whisper warm against his skin. "If I did, I would not have nodded." The wind raged on, the snow beat down, but within the small cabin another warmth grew. Not from fire, but from two people once shattered, now choosing each other. That night marked the turn. What had begun in command and survival was now given freely, not by force, but by choice. Dawn after the storm came like a miracle. Snow still lay heavy outside, but within the cabin, the warmth of a long night had changed everything. When Aveline opened her eyes, she saw Eli lying on his side, the first light touching his weathered face still shadowed with fatigue. His arm held her fast, as though letting go would see her vanish into the white beyond. She shifted slightly, and his eyes opened at once. No longer the cold stare of those first days, now gray eyes softened, touched with sleep. He said nothing, only leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead. A brief kiss, yet it set her blood alight. From that day, all was different. In every gesture, Eli lost some of the hardness, gained a quiet gentleness. When she fumbled with the fire, he sat beside her, his scarred hands guiding hers, showing how to stack wood, how to coax flame from dying embers. When the fire sprang bright, she looked up, and Eli bent close, murmuring against her ear, "Well done." Only 2 words, but his breath seared her skin and heat flooded her cheeks. In turn, Aveline began teaching him letters. Long afternoons, while wind moaned through the pines, she opened the old Bible, spelling out line by line. Eli sat beside her, broad finger tracing the words. His voice was rough, awkward, his brow furrowed with each stumble. Aveline laughed softly, and Eli's glance cut sideways, a flash of challenge in his eyes. Suddenly he snapped the book shut, pressed her against the chair, and kissed her fierce, as if to punish her for that laugh. Aveline gasped, breathless, yet her heart pounded with a desire she had never known. The long winter days turned the small cabin into their whole world. In the rhythm of simple work, the breath of new affection slipped between them. While she sewed by the fire, Eli carved wood or honed a blade, though more often his gaze lingered on her face longer than needful. When she lifted her eyes and caught him, both flushed, then laughed together. But Eli did not always hold back. Once, as Aveline bent to wash a pot, he came up behind, lifting her onto the bench in one swift motion. Water splashed, laughter broke, and his heat pressed close as his hands traced the skin he now knew. They found each other again and again, on the bench, by the hearth, even when Eli returned from the woods with snow and mountain wind still clinging to his coat. Each moment brimmed with hunger too long denied, breaking free at last. Slowly, the cabin ceased to be a prison. It became a home. Meals shared, long nights by the fire, laughter and silence woven together. These showed Aveline they were living as man and wife in truth. At times Eli would crush her to him, whisper in her ear, "You are mine, Aveline." Yet the words no longer carried command. They sounded instead like a plea, a trembling vow, as if he feared losing her again. And Aveline, instead of resisting as she once did, only nodded, burying her face in his chest, hearing his strong heartbeat with her own. The winter outside was not yet done, harsh and unyielding. But inside, within the frozen world, something new had taken root. Not only the fire of their love, but within themselves, trust, companionship, and the beginning of a life far removed from the dark days that had come before. When winter yielded and patches of earth showed beneath the spring sun, Eli decided to take Aveline down to Cedar Falls for salt, flour, and medicine. At the sound of the word town, she faltered. Since Nathan's death, she had never set foot among a crowd, let alone beside Eli, the man whispered of across the valley as the Montana Beast. They arrived in a misty afternoon. The main street lay thick with thawing mud, lined with weathered wooden shops. As soon as they dismounted, the air shifted. Voices died, and stares turned sharp. "Look there," a colored woman walking with him. "Good Lord, she lives with that brute from the mountains? Disgraceful." The whispers struck like blades. Aveline clutched her shawl, eyes down, quickening her steps to escape the gaze. But Eli would not allow it. His rough hand caught hers, warm and unyielding, tilting her chin upward. "Hold your head high," he murmured. "You owe them nothing." They stepped into Muller's store. The room thickened with silence. Mrs. Hartley, the preacher's wife, famed for her iron tongue, stood in the center. Her lined face twisted, eyes alight with scorn, as if she had found prey. "Shameful!" she near shouted, drawing every glance. "A widow, not long bereaved, now throws herself at a beast. A stain on this town." Aveline froze. Heat rushed to her face, ears ringing with humiliation. The whispers outside swelled into cruel laughter. She longed to flee, to vanish, but Eli's hand anchored hers, steady as bedrock. He stepped forward, his voice cut low and rough, carrying through the store. "That's enough." All fell still, his gray eyes fixed on Mrs. Hartley, cold as forged steel. "She is not yours to judge. Her name is Aveline, and from this day, before you, before this town." He paused, tightening his grip on her hand, his voice iron. "She is my wife." The words struck like thunder. Silence broke, rippling into murmurs. Not only disdain, but surprise, even a flicker of respect. Aveline's heart pounded. She turned to him, caught his eyes, not hidden, not cold, but resolute, as though he had lifted her into the light and set her in a place she had never thought hers to stand. Mrs. Hartley's mouth worked soundless, her lips tight, hands trembling with fury. But under Eli's unflinching stare, she withered, stepping back into silence. Eli turned, his hand never leaving Aveline's. "We need salt, flour, and shot," he told Muller, voice brooking no refusal. The shopkeeper swallowed hard, hurried to pack the goods, daring no protest. As they left, Aveline felt the weight of every gaze. yet it no longer mattered. Eli's hand bound hers, and in their steps together, she heard the quiet song of a beginning, no longer pitied, no longer alone. On the trail back to the cabin, Eli reined his horse, leaned close, his voice rasping against her ear. They can think what they will. But you are mine, not by mountain law, but because I chose you. And you chose me. Heat surged in her cheeks, her eyes wet with sudden tears. She nodded, resting her head against his shoulder. In the chill of a mountain spring, her heart burned warmer than it ever had. The first days of spring seemed calm, but in the wild mountains, danger always lurked. One morning, Aveline woke shivering, her body seized with chills. Her skin burned, sweat soaking her brow, yet her hands lay cold as ice. Eli had just come back from the woods. One look, and he knew. "You've got a fever," he rasped, a flash of panic in his eyes. Aveline tried a faint smile, shook her head, but a fit of coughing tore away the denial. The fever clung all that day. She drifted in and out of delirium, lips cracked, breath hot and shallow. Eli stayed by her side, changing cloths, feeding the fire, yet fear grew sharper in his face. He had seen this before. Years ago, winter fever had taken his wife and small daughter. Now the ghost of that past returned, reaching for the only woman he had left. By nightfall, Aveline whispered in her haze, "Don't leave me, Eli." Her voice was so faint it felt like a blade twisting in his chest. He could not wait. Eli pulled on his hide coat, shoved dried meat into a pouch, and bent to kiss her fevered brow. "I'll be back. Hold on." She gave no reply, only clutched his hand in her sleep. He pried it free gently, squeezed once as if swearing an oath, and stepped into the frozen dark. The road to Cedar Falls was far, crossing mountains and rivers, but Eli drove himself like a man hunted. Snowmelt turned paths to mire, boots heavy with mud, breath pouring in clouds. He slipped once, shoulder smashing against stone, blood seeping through his coat. Still he pressed on. One thought drove him: she cannot die. Not again. At dawn he stumbled into town, body spent, lungs ragged. He slammed into the apothecary, voice a growl. "Fever medicine, anything to save her." The shopkeeper stared at the giant, clothes soaked, streaked with blood, eyes burning with desperation. Eli seized the bottle, flung silver onto the counter, and turned back into the storm without rest. The road home stretched long, but he cared nothing for it. By dusk he reached the cabin, staggering, eyes bloodshot, breath broken. In his hand he carried the small vial as if it were treasure. Aveline lay still on the bed, lost in fever. Eli mixed the draught with trembling hands, lifted her gently, coaxing each drop past her cracked lips. "Drink, Aveline. You must live," he muttered, half command, half prayer. That night he never left her side. He sat gripping her hand, feeding the fire, wiping her brow. When chills shook her, he piled more furs. When heat rose, he pressed cool cloths to her skin. His eyes never closed, fixed on her face pale as paper. In the silence, tears slid down his rough cheek unnoticed. The memory of wife and child flickered like ghosts, but this time he whispered, "No, Lord, don't take her. She is mine." Let her stay. Toward dawn, the fever broke. Aveline stirred, gave a soft cry, and opened her eyes. Before her was Eli, eyes hollow, hand still locked around hers. When he saw her awake, his shoulders shook with release. She raised a weak hand, brushed his rugged face, her finger catching the tear that had not yet dried. "You watched me all night," she whispered, voice hoarse yet full of feeling. "I was afraid," Eli choked. "I lost my wife, my child. I couldn't. Not again." Tears blurred her sight as she squeezed his hand tight. For the first time she saw in those gray eyes not only steel but fear, grief, and love burning fierce. She gave him a faint smile. "You won't lose me, Eli." In that cabin, as dawn spilled its light, it did more than drive back the night. It shone into two hearts bound by a trial of life and death, and found them holding to each other all the more. The days after the fever passed seemed to move slower inside the cabin. Aveline was still weak, yet each morning she opened her eyes to find Eli sitting nearby, his gray eyes etched with worry as he watched every breath she took. He no longer let her bear any burden. Wood, water, hunting. He carried it all, leaving her to rest and gather strength. Aveline did not protest. For the first time in her widowhood, she felt the quiet care of a man. And Eli, hard as the mountains themselves, now revealed in every action a clumsy but earnest tenderness that made her heart tremble. One afternoon, with late sunlight slanting through the pines, Eli sat beside her teaching how to carve arrowheads. She leaned close, her fingers clumsy, blade slipping near. Eli's hand caught hers, holding firm. In that instant, his broad, warm hand covered her small one, and they both stilled. His eyes no longer carried the old chill, but a steady glow, like a coal hidden beneath ash. That evening, by the fire, Aveline opened the old Bible, patiently guiding Eli through each word. He muttered the sounds, brow furrowed like a stubborn child. When he stumbled, Aveline laughed, her voice bright as glass ringing in the small room. Eli did not laugh. He only watched her, his gaze deep and intent, as though etching every line of her face into memory. Days followed days. Each brief touch, each glance became threads binding their hearts. And when night fell, Eli could no longer always hold back. He would lift her into his arms, set her on the bench, kiss her with a hunger that seemed to swallow the years of loneliness. She no longer turned away. Her arms wound around him, her answer given in full surrender. They were no longer strangers forced together. With each moment, they became man and wife in truth. Even without vows or rings, their hearts had already claimed one another. One night, after the fire had burned low, Eli lay beside her in the furs, his arm locked around her waist, holding as though she might vanish if he let go. At last he spoke, his voice hoarse, hesitant as if dragging the words from deep within. "Aveline, you are not a possession, not something I own. You are everything to me." Aveline's heart faltered. The words were simple, but heavy as stone. Since her husband's death, she had lived with loss, with the pity or scorn of others. Yet here was a man once thought a beast, placing his life and soul into her hands with those trembling words. She turned to face him. In the dying glow of the fire, his eyes shone, waiting for her answer. She raised her hand, brushed the scarred line of his cheek, and whispered, "Eli, my heart has belonged to you for some time. I only lacked the courage to say it." He froze, then crushed her to his chest, his breath shaking as though he had risen from a deep abyss. No more mountain law, no more command. Love had found its name. That night they spoke no further. They lay close, listening to the rhythm of hearts beating as one. Outside, the wind stirred through the pines. Wolves howled in the distance. But in the small cabin, love had taken form, born in loss and storm, now sealed by vows unspoken, yet binding all the same. From that moment, they were no longer rescuer and rescued, nor master and captive. They were each other's. The days that followed moved with a gentler rhythm, as though the mountains themselves had stilled to honor what had bloomed between them. The storms had lessened, yet the nights still carried sharp cold. But within the cabin, warmth no longer came only from fire or furs. It lived in their glances, in the unspoken threads that tied them tighter each day. Eli rose before dawn, splitting logs outside with steady strokes, his breath rising in clouds. Aveline often woke to the sound of the axe biting into wood, and through the frosted window she saw him, broad shoulders bent to the work, hair damp with sweat despite the chill. There was a raw steadiness to him, and when he carried the wood inside, dusting snow from his coat, he always paused at her bedside, eyes softening as though to make sure she was still there. She would smile faintly, whisper, "Good morning." And in that small exchange, more was said than hours of speech could hold. As her strength returned, Aveline began to take small tasks back into her hands. She mended his torn sleeve with careful stitches, baked cornbread with the last of the flour, swept the corners where dust gathered. Eli frowned each time she bent to lift a pail or leaned too long over the fire. Yet he did not stop her. Instead, he hovered close, his hand ready to steady her, his silence betraying both worry and pride. One evening, as twilight painted the snowfields violet, Eli returned with a fresh kill, a young deer slung across his shoulders. He laid it on the block outside, then called Aveline to the door. "Come see," he said, his voice softer than usual. She stepped out, the wind cold against her cheeks. Eli showed her how to cut, where to trim, guiding her hands with his own. His fingers wrapped over hers on the knife, steadying each motion. The scent of pine and blood mingled in the air, harsh yet grounding. Aveline glanced up once and found him watching not the work, but her face. She felt the weight of it, that quiet reverence, and for a moment she forgot the blade entirely. Later, as they cooked the meat together, Eli broke the silence. "You're stronger than you know," he murmured. Aveline looked at him, startled. He kept his gaze on the fire, but his words carried weight. "I thought I'd live alone till the end. But you've brought life back to these walls." Her throat tightened. She had no reply, only reached to place her hand on his. His rough fingers turned, enclosing hers, as natural as breathing. That night, with snow drifting soft against the roof, they sat by the fire longer than usual. Aveline read aloud from the Bible, her voice steady, the words rolling into the stillness. Eli leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, as though letting her voice wrap around him like a balm. When she finished, he opened his eyes, and for the first time in years, he smiled. Not a grim, fleeting curl of the lips, but a true, unguarded smile. It struck her harder than any declaration could. She laughed, almost in disbelief. "I've never seen you smile like that." "Maybe I'd forgotten how," he answered simply. The following nights carried the same pattern. Quiet tasks shared, glances caught. The slow building of something that needed no witness. The bond between them was no longer born of necessity, but of choice. reaffirmed with each small act. The way Eli brushed snow from her shoulders after she stepped in from the cold. The way Aveline mended his glove and slipped it back into his hand without a word. One stormy evening, when the wind rattled the shutters hard enough to shake the walls, Eli found her standing near the door, gazing out into the swirling dark. He stepped up behind her, his chest brushing her back, his warmth surrounding her. Without thinking, she leaned into him. His arms closed around her, slow but sure. "Does it frighten you still?" he asked, his voice rumbling low. "Not anymore," she whispered. "Not when you're here." He rested his chin against her hair, breathing deep. For the first time, he felt not only the need to protect, but the freedom to be vulnerable. Aveline sensed it, the weight of his body settling against hers, the way his breath shook slightly before evening out. She placed her hand over his, fingers intertwining, and in that gesture he let go of some part of the darkness he had carried alone. When they turned from the door, the storm outside raged on, but within the cabin it no longer mattered. Eli guided her back to the furs by the fire, his hand firm yet tender on her back. They lay together once more, not as strangers bound by law or fate, but as two hearts that had chosen each other fully. As sleep edged near, Aveline whispered into the hollow of his throat, "We've both lost so much, Eli. But maybe all that loss, it led us here." His arms tightened and he answered, voice raw, "Then it was worth every mile of it, if it brought me to you." The fire dwindled, casting only faint shadows on the walls, but their bodies drew close. Warmth shared skin to skin. They needed no vows spoken, no rings exchanged. Their hearts had already given what mattered most. In the stillness, Aveline listened to his heartbeat, strong and steady beneath her ear. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, peace settled in her chest. Eli pressed a kiss into her hair, sealing the silence with a promise that needed no words. Outside, the wolves called across the ridges, their cries echoing through the pines. Once that sound had meant fear. Tonight, it was only the wild's reminder. Love had found them here, in the loneliest place, and made it a home. That spring came early. Snow melted, revealing slopes of tender grass, and the stream in the valley sang like the hymn of a new beginning. Amid the vast wilderness, Aveline and Eli made their choice. They would marry. No crowd, no town gathered. Only a few who truly knew them, who respected what they had found. On that day, the sky was clear, clouds drifting like white sails across a blue sea. Eli built a simple arch from pine branches, weaving in wildflowers that young James Fletcher, fond of Aveline, had gathered. It stood alone in the meadow, but in their eyes it was a cathedral. Aveline wore a cotton dress she had sewn through the winter, plain, without lace or frill, as simple and honest as her heart. Wildflowers pinned her dark hair. Her hands trembled against the fabric, caught between nerves and joy. Eli stood beneath the arch in his cleanest shirt, hair combed, waiting with a steady gaze. When Aveline walked toward him, step by step across the grass, his chest tightened. This woman, once a widow alone, once trembling in the storm, now came to him as a vow that love had risen out of hardship. Only a few witnessed. The Fletchers, Reverend Morrison from Cedar Falls, and a handful of quiet supporters. Their presence made the moment more sacred. Reverend Morrison lifted his voice, rich and solemn, carrying over the mountain air. Today, before God, before these hills and streams, we bear witness to the union of Eli Carter and Aveline Hayes, a bond not of chance alone, but of choice, of love found in the hardest places. The spring breeze stirred, lifting Aveline's dress and hair. Eli heard nothing but his own heartbeat. When the Reverend asked, "Eli Carter, do you take Aveline to be your wife? To share joy and sorrow? To endure every storm?" His voice came hoarse but steady. "I do." Then the Reverend turned. "Aveline Hayes, do you take Eli to be your husband? To walk with him through all your days, in sun or storm?" Aveline lifted her tear-bright eyes, pride glowing through the shimmer. "I do," she whispered, the sound carrying across the valley. They exchanged plain rings, silver bands Eli had forged from scrap metal found the winter before, etched with a small mark to seal memory. As he slid hers onto her hand, Eli bent to kiss her fingers, a promise spoken without words. When their lips met, no voice stirred. Only the wind through pines, the stream's murmur, and the shy but heartfelt applause of those who stood with them. In that moment, no beast, no widow, only a man and woman joined in love beneath the mountain sky. Afterward, they sat in the meadow for a small feast brought by friends. Cornbread, roasted meat, and a simple cake the Reverend had carried from his church. Laughter rose, bridging distances, drowning out the whispers of Cedar Falls. At sunset, the sky burned red as fire. Aveline rested her head on Eli's shoulder. His arm wrapped her close, his voice low against her ear. "Now you are truly mine, not by the law of the mountain, but because my heart chose, and I know your heart chose me." Aveline smiled, tears shining. Her reply was soft, yet sure. "Yes, Eli. Today my heart has found its home." In that moment, the Montana wilderness seemed to still, bearing witness to a love that had survived storms and judgment, to become something sacred, a home of its own. The summer after their wedding, Eli and Aveline set their hands to building a new house. No longer the lone cabin buried deep in the pines, but a sturdy home of timber on a gentle hillside, only half a day's ride from Cedar Falls. Close enough to reach the community when needed, yet far enough that mountain winds still swept the mornings, and the wilderness Eli had always belonged to never left them. The new house was not large, but it was warm. Eli cut the beams, raised the frame. Aveline laid planks, stitched curtains, planted a patch of flowers by the porch. Day by day they worked together, sweat soaking their shirts, laughter rising when they saw their efforts take shape. They called it their true home, not because it was larger or brighter than the old cabin, but because it was built with love tested in storm and fire. At night, they sat on the porch, hand in hand. The glow of a lamp lit Aveline's proud, gentle face. Eli often said nothing, only tightened his grip, as though binding the moment into memory. Far off, wolves howled along the ridges. Once that sound had meant fear. Now it was only the breath of the wild, reminding them where they belonged. The town of Cedar Falls slowly changed its gaze. Those who once sneered now gave quiet nods when Eli walked beside Aveline, when she entered a shop calm and steady. Reverend Morrison often visited, bringing books for Aveline and counsel for them both. Families asked Eli's help with hunting or mending roofs, and he gave it with little talk, only a faint smile. Aveline taught letters to children, her gift of reading rare on the frontier. Life was not easy. Winters remained harsh, Storms still tested the spirit. Yet Eli and Aveline were no longer alone. They had become a pillar for each other and for those around them. One late evening, as the sun slipped behind the purple mountains, Aveline set a cup of tea on the porch table. Eli sat watching the last rays fade. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I never thought I would have a home again," she whispered. He squeezed her hand, answering low, "And I never thought my heart would open again." Silence followed, the mountain wind and wolf song carrying the words they left unsaid. From widow and wild man, two souls once lost had become a family. Their home needed no red roof nor high walls, only faith, and the choice to keep choosing each other. And here, on this hard but generous land, love had been reborn. The second winter passed in their new home. Snow covered the hills, trees stripped bare in the cold, but inside their cabin the hearth always glowed. Its warmth came not only from the stacked wood or thick hides, but from the greater joy ahead. Aveline was heavy with child. For weeks, Eli grew comically cautious. He forbade her from lifting anything, would not let her step outside when the snow was deep. "I'm not made of glass," Aveline teased, yet her eyes shone warm. The man who once roamed like a wolf now stumbled through being husband and father-to-be, and he did it with a devotion she had never believed herself worthy of. The day came on a gray morning, wind rattling the shutters. Aveline gasped with the first sharp pain. Eli was there instantly, fear flashing in eyes weathered by storm and hunt, fear rarer than any he'd shown even to wolves or blizzards. "I'll fetch Reverend or Dr. Morrison," he stammered. She gripped his hand, sweat beading her brow. "No time. I need you. Now." He drew a breath, face taut as a drawn bow, then nodded. He stoked the fire, set water to warm, laid blankets thick. His broad hands trembled as he steadied her, soothing her through each wave of pain. The wind outside howled with her cries, with her ragged breath. Eli whispered over and over, "You're stronger than these mountains. You'll make it. I'm right here." Through the rending pain, Aveline clung to him. In the firelight she saw his eyes, not cold as the day they met, but filled with fear, with love, with fierce resolve. And then, as the morning dimmed, a cry pierced the storm, a child's first cry. Eli, with shaking hands, lifted the small red bundle. A daughter, alive and strong. He stared at her, then at Aveline, his eyes wet, his voice broken. "An angel. Aveline, you've given me everything." She smiled faint through tears of exhaustion and joy. "No, Eli. We gave each other everything." He placed the child in her arms. Aveline held her close, felt the tiny warmth, fragile yet certain as a miracle. The baby stirred, fists searching for her mother. Eli sat at the bedside, arms wrapping them both. In the small wooden house, he whispered the name they had chosen long ago. Clara, Clara Reed. Outside, snow still blanketed the world. Wind still called through the ridges. But inside, a new chapter had begun. That night, Aveline did not sleep. She watched Eli bent over the cradle, his wide shoulders trembling as his rough hand brushed the baby's hair. In the firelight, he looked no longer wild but gentle, already a father, a man who had found his harbor at last. "Eli," she whispered. He turned, eyes glistening. "Thank you for being here, for never leaving." He clasped her hand, once so cold, when she buried her first husband in the storm. now alive with strength. I thought my heart had died with the past. But you and our child have made it beat again. This is home, Aveline smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. Clara breathed softly in sleep, like a hymn of peace. Far off, a lone wolf called across the ridges. But instead of fear, the sound carried welcome, as if the wild itself blessed the child's arrival. And in that moment, Aveline knew. From a widow lost in the storm and a man once called a beast, they had become a true family. Clara, born in the heart of winter, was the living proof that love could rise from ashes, take root, and grow as steadfast as the mountains themselves.